You're good to go.
Okay. All right, that's great. I'm Judith Jones. I'm the coordinator of the Manitoulin Phragmites Project. I've been fighting Phragmites for about the last 7 years on Manitoulin Island, which I think gives me enough credentials to tell you about Phragmites. The Manitoulin Phragmites Project has controlled more than 90 locations, more than 90 sites with Phragmites, controlled or eradicated. For us, a site is anything from a few stems to 50 hectares of habitat with 20 hectares of Phragmites in it. So we've seen a lot of Phragmites. So this talk is about American Phragmites, sometimes called native Phragmites, versus European Phragmites or invasive Phragmites, and how to tell them apart, and whether or not American Phragmites can ever be a problem, and how we know, and whether to manage it or not. And this is kind of my state of my knowledge about this. It's taken me 7 years to figure this all out. So these are my professional opinions about this. It's possible that not everyone will agree, but what I'm trying to do is to at least present the problem and show you what the issues are. On Manitoulin, I think we have a lot more American Phragmites than most places do. At least this is what I'm starting to understand. So in Southern Ontario in the United States and perhaps some other places, I think you probably don't have as much American Phrag, and this might not be an issue for you, but at least how to identify them is a useful thing, especially if American Phragmites is something you need to protect, then how to identify it is probably useful. So I'm talking from Manitoulin Island in Ontario in Lake Huron. If you're watching this video from some other part of the world like Europe or the Middle East, the things that we say about Phragmites may not apply. Phragmites is a very tall, robust, invasive grass in our area, and it can destroy natural habitats by eliminating the vegetation in wetlands and shores and beaches and other natural places. And it has been called Canada's worst invasive plant. We have another video on our YouTube channel that will tell you what Phragmites is and why it's a problem and how to identify it and what to do about it. And you could see that it could be a really bad problem, because if you had this in front of your cottage, you wouldn't be having a good time on your beach. We also have a very short 7-minute video that shows you what to do about it, how to do the techniques that can help you control it or get rid of it. But this video is specifically about the 2 different types of Phragmites in North America. So the first thing you have to do is make sure that you know how to identify Phragmites. Our other videos can help you with your identification skills. So the What is Phragmites video talks in depth about how to identify it. But just as a refresher, things that you see here, these are cattails and irises, and these are other native plants, and they have all their leaves coming from the bottom like a green onion. They don't have a central stalk with leaves coming off like a corn stalk. These are all from the bottom. And also that brown hot dog thingy, that's the seed head for the cattail. So these are not Phragmites. So the first thing is, how do you identify these 2 things? Sometimes they're called 2 different races or 2 different subspecies, because most people don't have a good grasp about taxonomy and what's a subspecies and what's a species. We're just going to call them 2 different races. In the hint about this slide is that they're both right in front of you. The taller stuff is the invasive or European race, and the shorter stuff is the American race. I prefer to use the word American Phragmites as opposed to native Phragmites, because I think the word native implies something. It implies something natural, but what we're talking about, and the reason for this talk, are cases where American Phrag isn't natural. And also the word native, at least in my part of the world, implies certain cultural values that might be based on ancient traditions that should be respected. So I'm going to call this particular plant American Phragmites. And this talk tells you the general tendencies of this species. So here they are. And don't write all these down. You're going to see a lot of examples. I hope that I have photos and slides of all these different characters so that you can see them in front of you. And also, if you download the best management practices documents, you'll see the same pages that I've copied here into this presentation. So these are the general tendencies for these 2 different races. So we can say that the European species is usually more aggressive. It's usually taller. The leaves tend to point upward. They're grows more densely. It has a ridged stem that's not smooth or shiny. The stems are usually green, but they can be red tinged. Anyway, I don't need to read this whole list to you because you will see a lot of examples. But what I want to stress is that these are general tendencies, but no one character is foolproof, unfortunately. You can't always go by the density, unfortunately, because American Phrag can grow very densely. You can't always go by the height because American Phrag can be 9 feet tall. You can't only go by the color because unless you have both of them standing side by side, sometimes it's hard to know what color you're really seeing. These are tendencies, so always use more than one character if you can. And you see my note on the bottom, it says European Phrag can be sparse and reddish, and American Phrag can be more than 2 meters tall and 110 stems per square meter. So stress again, no one character is foolproof. And you can see the sources on the bottom in case you're curious about where these characteristics come from. There's some literature on the bottom. This is a very good resource on both of these two races. This is the newer best management practices document. A best management practices document is a thing that tells you what techniques work and what don't. It makes it so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to try everything. Someone's already done it. And this one will tell you what techniques work in which situations and how to do them. It's a very useful document. The newer one tells you a lot about species at risk. And this document does talk a lot about the two different races. This is the older document. It's still a very good resource. It's a little bit easier to read, a little bit shorter download, has a very good explanation of the techniques to use with Phragmites. As I said before, these links are both on our Facebook page. So this is a page from the newer best management practices document. So if you download that, you'll be able to see this. It's a little confusing sometimes. Even I get confused, so we should go through it a little bit. So the first characteristic is stand density. I'm going to show you a lot of slides from Manitoulin Island of both of these things, so don't worry about it. You can see that in the American column, stand density is a little bit thinner, sparser compared to the European one. And if you keep looking at that same stand density line there's two other characters to note. And one of them is that on American Phrag, the leaves spread outward, and on European Phrag, they spread upward. It's a tendency, right? Also, the flower clusters on the American Phrag tend to be olive green or tan, and they tend to be darker purple or brown, dark brown on European Phrag. If we go down to the next line and you see stem, American Phrag usually has a shiny stem. It's usually reddish, not always, but usually shiny and red. And European Phrag is usually dull, sometimes rough, sometimes has grooves in it, and usually tan. It can be red, but it usually is tan. Go down to the bottom and you see where it says leaf. This is where it's a little confusing because the first photo under the American column with leaf shows you both kinds. The one in the foreground is the American Phrag. It's more yellow-green. The one in the background where the red arrow is the European one. It's more blue-green. And then in the next, underneath the European column, when you see the word ligules, if you were in my talk last week and I talked about the shirt collar, where on the stem, where the leaf clasps the stem, if you look inside, down in here where the leaf goes around the stem and there's a little shirt collar, a little membrane in there, that's the ligule. So what we're saying is that European Phrag has almost no ligule. It's not even a millimeter. It's hardly, you can't even measure it. Whereas American Phrag has a very tiny ligule, maybe a millimeter. Okay, so here's that slide from last week. See the membrane on the right? That's not Phragmites, that's Phragmites look-alike, but just what a ligule is. But Phragmites doesn't have that collar. It just has some very tiny little stand-up little hairs there. But just to remind you what a ligule is. Okay, so let's go through the different characteristics here. Typical stand density and stature for these two races. This is Mud Bay on Coburn Island, by the way. You can see this particular site has both of them in it. The very tall stuff, dense, is the European Phragmites, and the shorter, more sparse stuff is the American Phragmites. That's pretty typical. This is the top of South Bay in Wikwemkong unceded territory, taken from a boat, so it's not in great focus. You can see clearly the European frag is very dense, very tall, has a tan stem, and further in the back, there's some other stuff that's not as dense. Typical stand density, if you have European frag really densely, you can't see it, you can't walk through it. That's us trying to control it in 2017. This is typical stand density for American Phragmites. It's not as dense, but it's still pretty dense. You can see the reddish stems there too. This is all American Phragmites as well. You can maybe see through it. The typical stem color and texture, these are both of them growing together as close together as my fingers are in one hand. At first, I had trouble believing that these were two separate plants because they're so intermingled here. You can see that the European frag with the orange arrows has a dull colored stem, and the American frag has the reddish stem. It's not foolproof, but mostly, usually red for American frag, not always, but usually, and more of a rough texture on the European frag. Here's a close-up of some pieces of European frag. This was a slide from last week showing how the little pieces sprout, but it also gives you, if you look at the bottom right, sort of in the heel of my hand, you get a close-up of the stem and you can see the ridges in it. It's not shiny, it's a little rough, and it's got these little ridges or grooves in it. So this is European frag, the stem. So yes, American frag is usually red stemmed, but European Phragmites can be red stemmed as well. If you look at the runners there, they're red. This is European Phragmites, so it's not foolproof. So the ligule size, see where my red arrow is pointing into the armpit of the leaf there. It's pretty much not European Phragmites, but this is American Phragmites with a yellowy green leaf color. And you can see there's a very tiny little brown band of tissue there where the leaf hugs the stem. So that shows, this tiny brown band shows this is American frag. And if you look in where the red arrow is going, you'll see that there's pretty much nothing there. It's non-existent really, you couldn't measure it. So anyway, this is European frag, no ligule at all. Oops, I missed one. So the typical flower cluster and the timing of flowering, European Phragmites flowers late, flowers September, October in Ontario anyways. And it usually has a dark brown or a purple cluster on top. This is Michael's Bay, should look familiar to Megan. And typical flower cluster and timing for American Phragmites, usually tan or olive green or light brown, and flowers a little bit earlier, August, September. Typical leaf angle. European Phragmites has leaves that are tighter to the stem. They're pointing upward. They have a sharper angle to the stem, so pointing upward. And a typical leaf color is kind of a blue-green. As I said, it's hard to decide on what color you have if you don't have them both together, but in general, it's a little more blue-green. And here's the typical leaf angle for American Phragmites. The leaves tend to spread outward a little more, a little broader angle to the stem, and the leaf color is usually a little more yellowy green. And this is an interesting slide because it shows you American Phragmites in a natural habitat where it's maybe not being an invader, but we're going to get to that. So the question is, should American Phragmites ever be managed, cut, removed? Isn't it a natural native species? Is it a problem? It's taken me 7 years to decide. People have kind of given me a little bit of heck about why I'm cutting down this. To think of it now as a problematic native species, sort of like a raccoon in a way. Raccoons are natural indigenous species, but sometimes they're problems. Sometimes they're a problem as a result of humans because they're being helped along their way by humans. So here's my current thinking about this. whether or not to manage it, when to manage it, I've come up with a set of criteria, at least for myself, and these are suggested. This isn't hard and fast. This is what I'm suggesting, and I will show you examples of all of them. This is a quote from the Best Management Practices document from 2021, and it says that invasive Phragmites resembles native Phragmites, but that the native race rarely develops into monoculture stands and does not have the same undesirable impacts on habitat and biodiversity. And I found that this is not always true. And I will show you some slides of that. A monoculture stand means a stand where there's nothing but Phragmites because it's eliminated everything else. So it's just a big stand of just Phrag. So here's some examples. You've already seen these slides. This is just to show you again. Upper left there, we've got both kinds. And upper right, is it a problem if you have this and it wasn't there before and suddenly your beach is choked with it? Maybe it is. And here below is a monoculture stand of American Phrag. Both of those on the bottom are monoculture stands of Phragmites in various densities, which may or may not be a problem depending on your situation. And then the other thing that happened for me to help me decide on these criteria is that in 2019, Abigail Warren, who is actually in our meeting tonight, if you have any questions for her afterwards, as her project, she genotyped 33 samples of Phragmites from Manitoulin Island and Cobourg Island. And she was looking to see if there was any hybridization between these two races. And I thought for sure there would be, because I have places where American Phrag is acting invasively. And so I sent the ones that I thought were the most likely to be hybridized because they were acting so invasively. And yet her results showed that there was no hybridization. And so what this proved to me is that it proved that the things that I saw that were acting invasively were the American race. So here are some examples of things that were genotyped. This is a highway ditch west of Silverwater on Manitoulin Island, and this has 110 stems per square meter, and the plants were 9 feet tall, and this is American Phragmites as per the DNA genotyping. This is another part of that patch further down. You can see the density of it. Also genotyped as American Phragmites. This one also, it's hard to tell just how dense this is because the goldenrods are up a little higher than the Phragmites, so they look like they're all the same height when they're not really. But this is an incredibly dense patch, as you can see from the inset on the bottom right. Again, American Phragmites. And again, the genotyping showed that both races were present here together. And the same for this. It shows that both races are present here. And if you see the photo in the bottom right where they're growing so closely together like my fingers, I sampled this. I sampled this very thing. This is the photo that I took before I removed these plants to send for the genotyping. And they are indeed two separate races, two separate plants, and both kinds are there growing tightly intermingled. So clearly there may be some situations where American Phragmites is a problem, but then again, there also may be some places where it behaves the way the literature says when it's in its natural habitat. So the main thing I want to say is that the decision to manage it or not needs to be made on a case-by-case basis, depending on what's happening, what it's doing, what kind of habitat you have, and what your management goals are. So how to make that decision? These are the criteria that I've come up with so far. So these are times when you might want to manage. And that number one would be if there's evidence that it has been introduced at the site by human activities. And for example, I have places where there was no Phragmites at all in 2002. And now there's tons and tons of American Phragmites acting in an invasive manner. So to me, that shows that it's probably been introduced by human activities. And I'll show you slides of all of these particular things. If it's growing interspersed with the European race, then you're not going to manage only one, because how are you going to take this stem and not take that stem? If it's growing in really dense patches that have eliminated other plants and not as scattered stems, and it's impacting other vegetation, then that might be a management consideration. If it's interfering with some other values, like if it's going to wipe out some species at risk that you're trying to protect. If it's interfering with human safety or infrastructure, because if you get Phragmites in a sewage lagoon, you might have a very costly problem, or if it's interfering with ditch flow or sight lines on roads, those might be situations where you need to manage it. If it's growing in a place where people might spread it to some other sensitive ecosystem, like if it's growing in an ATV trail, you don't want it to move somewhere else. Or in general, if it's not in a natural habitat, and its natural habitat in North America is fen, which is kind of a peat-based wetland system, kind of like a bog or rich interior wetland, a very diverse wetland. If it's not in a really nice natural wetland and growing as scattered stems, that might be a consideration of when to manage it. So I'm going to show you some pictures of all these. Here we go. This is a situation where American Phragmites was introduced by people. And here's 2014. The ATVs were driving along the shore of Lake Huron when the water level was low and the ground was really muddy. And this is how it looked in 2016. And you can see little stems of American Phrag just along the water's edge. And by 2017, I think, there is us trying to manage it. This is a mix of both types, actually, but that's how long it took for us to have to deal with it. So there's a case where I had the documentation and I knew that it had been introduced by people. Here's that example that we've already talked about where they're growing interspersed. And these are the trucks or cutting machines that come from the Invasive Phragmites Control Center. And you can see that we're not going to manage one type and not the other type in this kind of situation. When you have this much Phragmites, if half of it is American Phrag and the rest of it is European Phrag, it's all going to be managed. Here's an example where American Phragmites was growing in a super dense patch and it was eliminating other plants. I let this go. I saw this in 2011 and in 2013, and I said to myself, that's American Phragmites. That's supposed to be a native plant. I'm supposed to let that go. And by the time it came to 2016, 17, 18, it almost wiped out half of the beach. And in fact, we ended up putting herbicide on it. So it's more a question of, is it doing anything? Is it having an impact? Is it eliminating other plants? In this case, it was. And this is the same with Providence Bay, which is Manitoulin's big public beach. When the water was low, there was a very large area of Phragmites as well that was starting to impact other plants. Here's an example of American Phragmites impacting species at risk. Houghton's goldenrod is a threatened species. It lives on shores and in alvars, which are limestone prairies. And there's American Phragmites right next to it, starting to come up onto the beach. So this is a case where you would manage it to protect the species at risk. And here's another one. The blue circle is pitcher's thistle. It's a species at risk that lives on dunes. And there's a stem of American Phragmites right next to it. You shouldn't never see bare skin when there's herbicide in the area. But this is the only slide I have of this. We sometimes will apply herbicide with a mitten so that we don't have to spray it. So it only falls on Phragmites. We wipe it onto the leaves with a mitten, and that's what we did here. In example 5, I don't have a good photo for this yet, but an example of if American Phragmites is growing in a place where it's interfering with human safety or infrastructure, ditch flow, agricultural drains, like that, that might be a reason to manage. And example 6 would be if it's growing in a place where it might be spread. And here it is right next to a place where people are driving their vehicles. We don't want them to drive through Phragmites and get the Phragmites on the tires and spread it somewhere else. You can hear a lot about Phragmites being spread by vehicles if you watch our other video. So here's an example of American Phragmites. It's not in its natural habitat. It's not growing as scattered stems. It's clearly not doing what it's supposed to be doing according to the best management practices document. So in this case, you might decide to manage it. So let's see some examples of when it is not a problem and when it is in its natural habitat. And these are mostly slides from Coburn Island. I had not seen, after 80 some sites of Phragmites, I had only seen Phragmites not grow as a scattered stems in less than a handful of situations until I went to Coburn Island, and then I saw these. So these are situations where it's not becoming a monoculture. Here's some scattered stems growing among some sweet gale and some other plants. Here's another one where it's growing at the edge of a wetland. Here's another one. Scattered stems, not impacting the vegetation. And here's another one from that wetland I showed you before, where there's a lot of American frag, very tall, growing interspersed, intermingled with all the other vegetation in a very rich wetland here. Same thing. So this one has a question mark on it because it took me a while to understand this. This is a small fen, which is a peat-based wetland. It's dominated usually by sedges. And I would say that in 2002, there was no Phragmites in it. And whether or not it was introduced in a natural way, whether these are natural introductions that have to be left alone, I don't know. I ended up deciding, we started out trying to control some of it, thinking to keep some of the area free from Phragmites so that there would be sedge-dominated areas in it. And we ended up stopping the management because it was causing a lot of trampling and I didn't like the way it was going. So this is a question mark. But you can see that it's not dense and it's not wiping out the other vegetation yet. Here's a problematic situation. I thought I should show one where I don't know what the answer is here. This is American Phragmites in a very large fen, a natural fen with a floating mat. And in this case, there's a high stem density of Phragmites. This is early spring, so it's not green yet. The Phragmites is maybe starting to reduce intermingled vegetation. Is this a natural progression of succession? Is this supposed to happen this way? I know from documenting this site in 2002 that American Phragmites was not there. Here's a close-up of the ground underneath it. Is it impacting the vegetation? I'm not sure. But it's a problematic place because if you wanted to manage it, what would you do? How would you do it? So decisions to manage American Phragmites need to be made on a case-by-case basis because it depends on the situation, what American Phrag is doing and what your goals are. In Northern Ontario, there seem to be some situations where American Phragmites does need to be managed, but there are places where American Phragmites is very scarce and it is an indigenous natural species that people are trying to protect. And the eastern seaboard of the US is one of those places where it was an indigenous species that had been there from time immemorial and now is being wiped out by the invasive type. So being able to identify it because it's something you want to protect is also valuable. So the criteria in this video are just suggested criteria for making management decisions. And this is a beautiful site that we managed. If you look in the bottom corner, you see that slide I showed you previously where American Phragmites was wiping out the beach. And this is how the beach looks now that we've managed it, and it is gorgeous. And that's the shut up and stop talking slide. And these are our sponsors.